Thank you, William, and thank you, Jonathan, for the very generous introductory remarks. I'm quite overwhelmed, and I'm also overwhelmed by the fantastic, well, there are so many of you here. It's terrific, and I see students, I see colleagues. That's great. And I want to say also thank you to my colleagues, because it was always thanks to your support and open-mindedness that I've always felt that the University of Birmingham is really my intellectual home. And I want to thank my family, my daughter and my wife, and my parents. Without you, I'm nothing. Nobody would be called an alarmist when saying that economic nationalism is on the rise. Economic nationalism seems easy to recognize, imposing import tariffs, restricting labor migration, challenging the most favored nation status, subjecting the market to the state. However, all of these policies could also be easily described simply as statist, as protectionist, or as interventionist. There is nothing that is essentially nationalist here. I want to argue here that economic nationalism, and this is very simple, but I think works really well, is best understood as any economic activity that is carried out with the objective of empowering the nation. Yes, that can mean tariffs, but it can also mean a very simple act like selling an apple. And apples will figure later. Economists and historians alike tend to agree that economic nationalism makes everybody poorer, especially if it's used as a knee-jerk response to economic crises. And with this lecture, I do not aim to rehabilitate economic nationalism, but I want to argue that we do not do this phenomenon justice when we dismiss it as a chauvinistic, irrational policy that has historically always been destined to fail. In the early 1880s, in a little village in the Russian Empire's northwestern provinces, a young peasant sold apples on his father's farm. He was in the company of his wife and his younger brother, Juozas, whom you see on the picture here. Juozas was enjoying the idleness and the warmth of the Lithuanian summer. But suddenly, a group of Jewish men turned up, and the situation turned hostile. The Jews pushed over the peasant's apple stall, smashed some apples, and stole others. Little Juozas froze, as did his older brother and his wife, because resistance seemed futile against this large group of attackers. The Jews cursed at them. "Fall to you people, for whom your land is not enough, that you need to take from us Jews to fill your pockets." Then they disappeared, leaving the young peasants dumbstruck and humiliated. The peasant's brother, Juozas Tumas Vaižgantas, would later become a Catholic priest and a major figure in the Lithuanian national movement. He would recount the anecdote of the apple stall attack later in his nationalist writings, vividly recalling the emotional distress caused by the event, how the color had disappeared from his sister-in-law's face out of shame, how the Jews had continued to scream curses and mockery as they left, how his brother stood with his head hanging, then became agitated with hatred like a child, complaining, scolding, ranting. How little Juozas was embarrassed that he had failed to protect his sister-in-law. However, in Juozas, as he wrote, a feeling of belated revenge began to boil. This, he wrote, was a lesson to him. If Lithuanians wanted to sell anything themselves, they had to be prepared for conflict with the Jews. And thus, Juozas wrote, the larger foray of the Lithuanians into the Jewish businesses began. So why did he consider this foray into Jewish businesses as so essential? This is something that I had focused on in my first book on Christian-Jewish relations in the Russian Empire's northwestern provinces. Jews, heavily discriminated against by Russian imperial law, had little choice but to make a living of petty trade. Lithuanian speakers, on the other hand, were almost uniformly peasants, many of them landless. During the rise of nationalism in 19th century East Central Europe, Lithuanian activists regarded this as the main obstacle to the sovereignty of the awakening Lithuanian nation. dominated by a Polish land-owning nobility and allegedly exploited by Jewish merchants and artisans, Lithuanians could not economically exist as a nation of their own. However, what is crucial here is that nationalists claimed that this had not always been the case. In a heavily mythologized medieval Lithuanian Grand Duchy, they claimed, ethnic Lithuanians had been a fully stratified nation, controlling all parts of the economy themselves. In this narrative, it was the 1569 Union of Lublin that ended national sovereignty by letting Poles and Jews to Lithuania, who then seized the land and turned the local population into a peasant vassal nationality. But now it was time for Lithuanians to reclaim the economic agency that was rightfully theirs. This historical narrative was not unique. In variations, it was at the core of nationalist agendas across East Central Europe. In the Czech lands of the Habsburg Empire, national activists urged their fellow Czechs to reclaim the economic agency that the Catholic League's victory at the 1620 Battle of the White Mountain had snatched from them. Estonians swore to reverse what they claimed was the colonization of Estonia through Teutonic Knights, which had resulted in centuries of Baltic German economic dominance. To Slovaks, the economic invaders were Jews and Hungarians. To Ukrainians, they were Jews and Poles. If we take this as a starting point of a national history of reclaiming economic sovereignty that works along this logic, we can spin a compelling narrative across the 20th century. Under imperial rule, before the First World War, the national movements promoted self-help, thus strengthening the oppressed nationalities against their oppressors. The collapse of empires after the First World War, or at the end of the First World War, allowed the creation of sovereign nation-states, thus completing the national reawakening of East Central Europe. And the governments of these states systematically strengthened the core nationalities against the resistance of overprivileged national minorities who, and this is important, these minorities conspired with the nation's international external enemies. As you can see here on this cartoon, the shipping of vast amounts of timber from Latvia to Britain, which many Latvians regarded as a threat to newly won sovereignty, was blamed on Jewish traders within Latvia rather than on British merchants. But all of these efforts of economic self-empowerment were cut short by Soviet and Nazi aggression. Under Soviet rule, private ownership, the natural economic model of the nationalities of East Central Europe in this narrative, was violently abolished. However, such a narrative of the restoration of economic sovereignty would stress that the nationalities of East Central Europe resisted, culminating in the anti-communist revolutions of 1990-91. Finally, nations again were in ownership of their statehood and the unchallenged masters of their own economic fate, an encroaching European Union notwithstanding. Nationalism loves stories of victimhood and victory. But this narrative of the success of economic self-empowerment that I have just laid out here is rarely ever articulated. Instead, national narratives stress politics, positing foreign oppression against national sovereignty, violent ruptures against peaceful evolution. And this is despite the fact that economic nationalism has driven large-scale, hugely impressive projects that have reshaped the face of the region. One example, for instance, is the Polish city of Gdynia. As interwar politicians feared that the free city of Danzig could not be trusted to provide independent Poland with access to the sea, the Polish government rebuilt a tiny nearby fishing village, Gdynia, into the Baltic Sea's most modern port. In the 1930s, Gdynia overtook Danzig's trade volume, and journalists from across the world celebrated Gdynia as Europe's only American city. Not least, we see how important Gdynia was for Polish statehood when we look at the responses of German nationalists who were worried that Gdynia made the infamous Polish corridor irreversible and thus perpetuated the territorial order of the hated Treaty of Versailles. And today, Gdynia remains Poland's wealthiest city. But as impressive as a narrative of national empowerment against all odds would be, it is a narrative we rarely encounter. And the reason for that was the Second World War. Very cynically speaking, This foray into Jewish businesses that the priest Juozas Tumas Vaižgantas had promoted was completed by the Nazis' war of annihilation. In Czechoslovakia and Hungary, more than 2/3 of all Jews were murdered. In Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, more than 80% of all Jews were murdered. And centuries-old traditions of Jewish trade and artisanry were wiped out. This meant that the key demand of economic empowerment was fulfilled. In the liminality of the year 1945, and possibly in ignorance of the full devastating scope of the Holocaust, this was a narrative that could still be articulated. Strikingly, Polish nationalist Jerzy Braun wrote in July 1945, "Today, there is no place for a Jew in small towns and villages. During the past 6 years, finally, a Polish third estate has emerged, which did not exist before. It completely took over trade, supplies, mediation, and local crafts in the provinces. Those young peasant sons and former peasant proletarians who once worked for the Jews are determined, persistent, greedy, deprived of all moral scruples in trade, and superior to Jews in courage, initiative, and flexibility. Those masses will not relinquish what they have encountered. There is no force which could remove them." Similarly, Czechs and Poles rejoiced that they could fill the economic gap left behind by the expulsion of millions of Germans in the final phase of the war. Lithuanian nationalists urged their compatriots to move to Vilnius to Lithuanianize what was formerly a Polish and now an empty city. Ukrainians sensed their own economic empowerment in the wake of the ethnic cleansing of Poles under Nazi rule and the following Polish-Ukrainian population exchanges that followed the war. Yet the relationship between ethnic cleansing and the trajectory of economic empowerment is nowhere more striking than with regards to the Holocaust, because the Holocaust and the complicity of local people in it remains one of the most consequential lenses through which outsiders view states in East Central Europe. It shapes these states' relationship with Israel, but also with the EU and the United States. Each year, thousands of descendants of Eastern European Jews visit from the US to visit their ancestors' hometowns, overgrown Jewish cemeteries, and boarded up wooden synagogues. EU accession was made contingent on a commitment to address the history of local involvement in the murder of Jews. Yet despite the rapid advances made in the 1990s, which identified perpetrators at a huge scale, the picture still remains incomplete. Perpetrators are often constructed as deviants of the nation and thus as outsiders, or worse, they are even rehabilitated. And we see how powerful this lens is if we think of the Russian narrative of Ukraine as a kind of Nazi nation that almost serves as the primary justification for the Russian invasion. I argue that this unsatisfactory and contradictory picture is the result of the clash of two irreconcilable historical events: the gradual economic empowerment of a hitherto oppressed first nationality at the expense of a second nationality, on the one hand, and on the other, the inconceivably violent mass murder of this second nationality at the hands of an outside force, but with considerable help from the first nationality. Well, one cannot be told without the other. Because if we try, then that means that what remains is a rump national narrative shorn of nationalism's key instrument, that is the economic empowerment, and with the gaping hole where the Second World War, the Holocaust, and ethnic cleansing more broadly should be. This is also because in a climate of Europe-wide political radicalization, the project of economic empowerment had turned violent in East Central Europe already before the Second World War. The rhetoric that Juozas Tumas had deployed, standing together, educating each other, was rapidly supplanted by an openly anti-Semitic economic nationalism, as it was, for instance, represented by, I want to go into a bit more detail here, the Interwar Union of Lithuanian Businessmen. That union, intent to Lithuanianize towns by seizing the urban economy from national minorities, is a remarkable study of how economic empowerment could work. First, it shows that economic empowerment required intermediaries. It wasn't a top-down policy. It couldn't work as a top-down policy. Even in Europe's 1930s, most governments were reluctant to openly promote the economic disenfranchisement of minorities. Lithuania, for instance, simply could not afford this. Fenced in by crippling conflicts with Poland and increasingly with Germany, the Lithuanian government was reliant on the goodwill of the Western Entente and thus on its ability to demonstrate that it offered Lithuanian Jews a square deal. The government thus promoted economic empowerment, but without being able to mention who would supply the economic agency that was supposed to be seized. What we see then is a policy that left the public guessing as to how it could be implemented in the first place. Who held the power that the Lithuanians were supposed to seize for themselves? Why did they hold it? Why was this unjust? The Union of Lithuanian Businessmen, who conceived of themselves as soldiers in the economic sphere, whose work goes hand in hand with the ambitions of the nation, could offer a much more coherent narrative. Lithuanians could only empower themselves if they fought against the Jews. What is interesting here is that neither the Union nor the government that the Union was not only independent from the government, but the government even publicly admonished it for its anti-Semitism. So there was no alliance between the two. But the Union still fulfilled a crucial function for the government because it provided meaning for the most important political project of interwar Lithuania. Only to Lithuanians who listened to the Union's radio broadcasts or read their newspapers could the government's economic reforms and policies make any sense at all. And it is telling that the Lithuanian government publicly declared its support for the Union only in 1939, when Europe became engulfed in the fog of war. That is when the government publicly said the Lithuanian government will support the efforts of the Union to eliminate the Jews from trade. And that is because economic empowerment was catalyzed by, no, it even hinged on moments of disorientation, of profound transformation, of compressed time, of powerful liminality. And its smartest proponents were fully aware of this. Accordingly, the Union of Lithuanian Businessmen enthused that the economic chaos of the Great Depression did not daunt them, but it even encouraged them in their fight for empowerment, as, quote, in times of general upheaval often shatter convictions which until recently seemed indisputable truths, but now appear swept away by the wind. And indeed, by the time the economy recovered in the mid-1930s, Lithuania's urban landscape was unrecognizable. The famous Jewish shtetls seemed to be dying even before the Second World War, as Lithuanian businesses sprung up while Jewish shops were boarded up in the shadows of the new warehouses, creameries, and grain elevators of vast state-sponsored cooperatives. When Stalin granted the city of Vilnius to Lithuania in the wake of the Nazi-Soviet destruction of Poland, Lithuanian politicians planned to solve the problem of Vilnius's Polish character by, quote, scraping the nest physically and economically. That meant to cleanse the city of Poles. The Jews of Vilnius, quote, incapable of hard, decent work, should be resettled to the countryside and thus put on the path to extinction. And here, in this violent moment and with the successes of economic empowerment that had been produced over the 1930s, it is impossible to overestimate the impact of the 1940 Soviet occupation of large parts of East Central Europe. Because Jews were not only regarded as Bolshevik collaborators, but really as an enemy force that had waited for the perfect moment to destroy the nation states and thus to roll back the grand project of economic empowerment and thus reassert their exploitative economic dominance. In 1943, then, under Nazi occupation, Lithuanian business representatives rejoiced that Jewish dominance in trade and crafts was a matter of the past. Quote, the war has put an end to this unnatural condition. Now, even in the field of industry, the Lithuanian can boldly look into the future. End of quote. There are several features that tie East Central Europe together. Early modernists stress the region's coherent social, economic, and multi-ethnic structure due to the long history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Modern historians emphasize how the region has been shaped by the conflict and collaboration of its large neighbors, Germany and Russia. Economic historians see the region as defined by agricultural predominance and a general backwardness. Political scientists often stress the region's character as a tapestry of small states that often resort to petty squabbles and ethnic violence. While none of these are necessarily wrong, I believe the defining aspect of East Central Europe is that it is a region where independent statehood has been contested more than elsewhere on the continent. In the late 18th century, Russia, Prussia, and the Habsburg Empire partitioned a major European power, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Then both the First and the Second World War were fought, among other things, over the question which empire had the right to build states, to destroy states, and thus to rule over the region. And then, behind the Iron Curtain, Soviet hegemony over East Central Europe became absolute. I believe that if we want to understand the nature and function of economic nationalism in East Central Europe, we need to view it through the lens of these constant challenges to national sovereignty. During the escalation of trade wars during the Great Depression, the League of Nations Assembly challenged the states of Eastern Europe to drop their import tariffs to help with Europe's economic recovery. And the Yugoslav foreign minister Vojislav Marinković replied, "No prediction of catastrophe following upon a customs war could daunt us. We have in any case to choose between one of two catastrophes, the catastrophe of the present and that of the future." So being regarded a nuisance was still preferable to losing sovereignty. At the time, but also in retrospect, East Central European interwar policies were often regarded particularistic or chauvinistic. But as I have tried to show in my 2020 book, Fragmentation in East Central Europe, these policies were often responses to the behavior of the major European powers. This behavior was based on the view that sovereignty in East Central Europe was merely a byproduct of the First World War, that it caused economic damage to Europe, and that the political elites of these new states were too immature, too emotional to be taken serious. German nationalists coined the term of seasonal states, bound to disappear once the political climate became more favorable. International businessmen avoided the region, fearing the status of these states could violently change at any time. After Hitler invaded Poland, E.H. Carr scolded the Western Entente for having awarded independent statehood to the region in the first place. By doing this, Carr said, the Western Entente had pursued, quote, a principle of political and economic disintegration in an age which called for larger and larger units. And this view that small states were a historical regression was shared from Germany to Britain, from Italy to France. But even after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, yes, until today, independent statehood in East Central Europe still seems contestable, reversible, temporary. In 1990, Norman Stone, then advisor to Margaret Thatcher, warned that the fall of the Berlin Wall would inevitably lead to an expansion of German power through the economic subjugation of Ukraine and the Baltics. So in a sense, 1918 all over again. Others predicted a failure of these states due to their inherent inability for economic and political cooperation. And sadly, this pessimism had a significant influence on Western responses to Russia's aggression in Ukraine. In 2015, former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt infamously justified Russia's annexation of Crimea by publicly doubting whether the territorial integrity of Ukraine was worthy of protection at all, given that Ukraine was, in his opinion, not a nation state. And this here is one of my favorite examples. As Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine ground to a halt in spring 2022, British entrepreneur Andrew Cook, CBE, wrote, quote, and this is wonderful, "It's time for some realpolitik. I suggest a partition with the river Dnieper the border, leaving eastern Ukraine a quasi-satellite of Russia and western Ukraine as an independent buffer state looking westward. Kharkiv and Lviv respectively could be the capital cities for the two new states, with Kiev a free city as were Tangier and Danzig in the past." This was to be followed by good old-fashioned plebiscites. It is very difficult to imagine how, say, Sweden or France could be subjected to such a geopolitical lens of casual colonialism. But this also this might be funny, but it also has very real implications. Because in East Central Europe, the sense of ontological security around the future prospects of one state is weaker than elsewhere in Europe. A loss of sovereignty is always a possibility, and it can come very quick. We should remember that whereas Poland was repeatedly wiped off the map, Germany survived as a state even after it had plunged the whole continent into chaos and death. Economic nationalism is thus regarded a measure to sustain sovereignty in a hostile international environment. Across East Central Europe, support for policies of economic nationalism is higher than elsewhere in Europe, for instance regarding labor migration, economic protectionism, and the sale of land to foreign citizens. Bearing in mind the close link between economic nationalism and sovereignty, it is also not surprising that this support changes with the international context, depending on whether the international context is more or less hostile. As the National Identity International Social Survey Program shows, public support for a ban on sale of land to foreigners, for instance, dropped from 2/3 during the profound economic crisis of the early 1990s to only slightly more than half around EU accession. But that still remains significantly above the EU average. It will be interesting to see if support for economic nationalism has increased again in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but the data for 2023 will be released only in the coming winter. Today, ethnic minorities are no longer seen as the main threat to the nation's economic agency. Rather, in today's nationalist discourses, they have been replaced with post-communist liberal elites, international finance, and Brussels. We see this most obviously in the rhetoric of populist governments. Two examples shall suffice here. When Viktor Orban stressed his economic successes in 2017, he laid out the path ahead. We need a national banking system that is in Hungarian hands. It doesn't need to be state-owned, but what matters is that it should be in Hungarian ownership. And when there is trouble, it should not seek to relocate funds elsewhere, but should seek to retreat here and protect it and maintain its positions here. And in Poland, Jarosław Kaczyński's Law and Justice Party, PiS, pushed to repolonize economic sectors that were deemed crucial for Polish sovereignty. When Kaczynski looked back at the achievements of his party, he framed these efforts as a fierce struggle to restore economic agency. We wanted a general change. The process we undertook had to and did go through battles against total opposition and pressure from outside, from other countries that wanted to see Poland helpless in the face of its external enemies. Some have called this, though perhaps this is an exaggeration, post-colonialism. That is why the entire history of these 5 or 6 years is a history of struggle. Regarded as the most existential internal threat to the European Union, solutions put forward to deal with populism rather helplessly focus on the promotion of the EU's alleged core values, such as tolerance, pluralism, progressivity, and the rule of law. But to understand the success of populism, we need to understand why populist parties are so successful at winning elections or at faring increasingly well at elections. And while this success is usually attributed to a vague appeal of nationalist, chauvinistic rhetoric, I believe that it is primarily due to these parties' social and economic policies, because they are highly successful in meeting expectations that were raised in East Central Europe across more than a century, across different regimes and by very different sets of historical actors and institutions. In Poland, for instance, the pre-1914 anti-Jewish boycott rhetoric of Roman Dmowski has remained alive and meaningful to many Poles because it was sustained, refined, and enriched by interwar politicians, but also later through the communist-era trade centralization efforts known as the Battle for Trade. I would like to return to Lithuania for a final time. As part of my ongoing research project, Subjectivities of Owning Land, I am currently examining how land reform shapes the relationship between states and societies. Asked if they supported a ban on the sale of land to foreign citizens, almost half of all candidates during the Lithuanian parliamentary elections of 2012 responded with yes. Given that public support, as we've seen earlier, for such a ban is strong, this might not be surprising. But it is indeed very surprising, given that such a ban would not be possible to implement in practice in the first place, because it would be incompatible with EU membership. Accession to the EU was contingent on opening the market for agricultural land to citizens from across the EU. But as a tool to mobilize the electorate, the rhetoric of economic nationalism, which heavily drew from a rhetoric around interwar land reform, was just too effective to ignore. In the wake of the elections, Lithuanian citizens concerned about Lithuania's national sovereignty within the framework of the EU organized a referendum to ban the sale of land. In a sense, this 2014 referendum movement was very typically populist, forming a broad church of disgruntled Cold War-era dissidents, EU skeptics, and nationalists. A high-profile historian affiliated with the referendum movement warned of the consequences should foreigners be allowed to buy land in Lithuania. Will we wake up in the same position as the Palestinian Arabs or the American Indians, he wrote. Not least, this is an explicit reference to the trajectory implicit in the narrative around interwar land reform. And the narrative goes like that: after a long struggle, this reform had finally reversed the foreign quasi-colonial appropriation of Lithuanian land. That reversal was reasserted in 1991 through privatization, but it was now again coming under threat by the EU. If EU citizens could buy Lithuanian land, this land would eventually end up Polonized at best or Russified at worst. Again, the referendum campaign suggested economic empowerment was about to be sacrificed on the altar of foreign rule. Dozens of celebrities rallied behind the referendum campaign, among them 84-year-old Emilia, who said, and I'm not sure 84-year-old Emilia actually exists, I can't get it in my head nor in my heart that we want to sell to foreigners the land for which we have fought, which we saved, for which we have sacrificed ourselves. The referendum ultimately failed, but it highlights the path dependency of economic empowerment through time and across historical ruptures. In this form, it was inconceivable without the blueprint of interwar land reform. This becomes evident when we look at Ukraine, where 2 decades later than in Lithuania, the 2021 land market law finally made it possible to sell Ukrainian land to foreigners. But when it came into effect in 2024, Ukraine's economic situation had fundamentally changed, and understandably, worries about the loss of national sovereignty were a lot greater. And when we compare online comments of Ukrainian readers to those of Lithuanians, the differences are striking. Because most interwar Ukraine had been under Soviet rule, and in the rest, Poles had owned much of the land. And for that reason, opponents of this land market law did not only resist opening the markets to foreign buyers, but to privatization in the first place. As opposed to Lithuania, where the principle of private ownership was largely unchallenged, Ukrainians, disheartened by oligarchy and corruption, interpreted the constitutionally guaranteed ownership of all land by the people of Ukraine in a decidedly more collective sense. The Ukrainian nation could only really own the land if nobody owned the land. I want to finish with a few concluding observations. The history of economic nationalism has never entered the dominant national narratives in East Central Europe. However, this exclusion has not resulted in an untarnished history of a heroic nation. Rather, it has severely limited the relevance that national history has for common people. Where national history stressed agency, they restricted to a heroic and often futile resistance against foreign oppression. Many East Central Europeans hold the view that their states have been and still are weak, and thus doomed to passivity in the face of external aggression. This view is reinforced by geopolitical debates that continue to posit the states of East Central Europe at best as second-tier small states and at worst as paranoid troublemakers that stand in the way of peace and prosperity. However, it is striking how profoundly economic nationalism has remade East Central Europe across the past 150 years. The idea that selling apples could be an act of contention is as absurd in Europe's East today than it is elsewhere on the continent. And this is not entirely a history of local agency, but it is also a history of local agency. 7 years ago, I curated an exhibition on the post-1918 East Central European nation states. The exhibition was shown on the Curonian Spit, a peninsula that was once at the border between the German and Russian Empire and today forms the border between the EU and Russia's Kaliningrad region. After my opening talk, a Lithuanian visitor walked up and said with genuine enthusiasm, "I was never aware that our interwar Lithuania had achieved so much. More Lithuanians should know. This is something that we can be proud of." And that made me rethink my own research quite a bit. My research had often focused on messy and rather uncomfortable aspects of history. And accordingly, I had often expected audiences to respond with indignation or even offense. There he is, the German who wants to lecture us about how we were actually the bad ones. But here I noticed that a truthful narrative that includes the messy bits, how acts of foreign rule interact with local rule, how disintegration interacts with integration, how discrimination interacts with education, is a lot more empowering than a grand national history, because it stresses that history was produced by people within East Central Europe itself, for the better or the worse, but often under the most adverse circumstances. Thank you.